Well, the deadly attacks of November 13th, 2015 led to a sea change in France's counterterrorism strategy. A decade later, there's a larger focus on preventing radicalisation, and the mechanisms behind it are better understood. Our Claire Paccalin is here to talk a bit more about this and her France in Focus show, France's Fight Against Extremism. Claire, is France now better at preventing violent extremism than it was 10 years ago?
So 10 years ago, the attacks in 2015 were a wake-up call here in France, not just for the public understanding, realising the threat against them, but also for politicians, for police, prison staff, teachers, social workers, doctors and psychiatrists as well. It was a wake-up call. At the time, there was a lot of talk about how prisons were a fertile ground for radicalisation, particularly Islamist radicalisation. So there were inmates inside prisons who were radicalising others. Someone might go behind bars for robbery. They might come out as a radical Islamist. This was the fear, and it was happening. It was happening under the noses of prison staff. Something had to be done. Now, we interviewed Joanna Cockrell and I and Gail Fonseca. We interviewed Dr. Guillaume Monod. He's a psychiatrist, and he spent the last 10 years going into prisons. He got interested in the topic of radicalisation after the 2015 attacks. He said he realised no one really knew anything about it. We were woefully underprepared. So he started going into prisons, speaking to prisoners who were identified as radicalised, and he began working with them. So I think we can take a listen to one of his soundbites now.
All sectors of society mobilized, not only the justice system, prison service and psychiatry sectors, but also the state education sector, child protection and charitable organizations. In 2015, hardly anyone knew anything about it. Now we have a real understanding of the phenomenon.
So Dr. Monod, who we just heard from there, he's worked with around 150 prisoners who've been radicalised or identified as radicalised. And his focus, he says, is looking at how vulnerable they are, how susceptible they are to recruiters and to that danger of becoming extremist. And we can listen to him again because he explains how he works as a psychiatrist.
My job is that of a medical doctor and a psychiatrist, so I'm not interested in the religious question. I'm not interested in the political question. That's not my area. My work is about the psychological mechanisms, about the psychological vulnerabilities that cause certain people, in certain cases, to find themselves indoctrinated into a sectarian and violent ideology.
So what Dr. Monod is telling us there is that there are some people who are more vulnerable, more fragile than others when it comes to whether or not they're a target for a radical recruiter. And he also mentioned, this is something that we found, Joanna Cockrell and I found when we were working on this France in Focus show, is that the word de-radicalisation is now no longer used by professionals in the field. They don't talk about de-radicalising someone. That is because in France, people have the right to have any opinion they want. The thoughts, the views in their mind, everyone has the right to think what they want, even if those thoughts are deemed as radical. What they don't have the right to do is turn those thoughts, those radical thoughts, into violence. They cannot express those radicalized thoughts with violence. And so now, instead of talking about de-radicalization, professionals in the field talk about disengaging from violence. So Dr. Monod is not trying to de-radicalize someone. He's trying to help someone disengage from the desire to carry out a violent act.
And how does it work? How do these recruiters function and choose people to target?
So we were able to speak to a former prisoner, Karim Mokhtari, who explained to us exactly what happened to him, how he became face-to-face with a radical Islamist recruiter when he was behind bars. Now, Karim Mokhtari had been put behind bars when he was 18 years old for armed robbery, and he said was the perfect target for a recruiter. And we can listen to Karim's testimony now.
Very quickly, I was approached by a self-proclaimed imam. He was more used to selling weapons and drugs. One day, our eyes met, and he came over to ask me if I was Muslim. I told him no, but that I would like to be. This self-proclaimed imam's preaching was extremely violent, extremely tough. He was adding fuel to the fire already burning inside me, and I was already struggling to find my place in society. I remember this self-proclaimed imam came up to me with a very, very dark look to tell me that I was now a Muslim and that my duty as a Muslim was to defend Islam. And according to him, defending Islam meant that I had to go kill the infidels wherever I found them. It was the first time in my life that I knew how to take a stand by saying no in a determined way. It was the best decision I could have made during my entire sentence, because that is not Islam. I had turned to Islam to stop being violent. He was pushing me towards more violence than I had ever even imagined.
So what Karim Mokhtar is explaining there to us is that he was able to say no to this Islamist recruiter when he was in prison. He was able to say no. He's made it his life's mission now to go into prisons. He shares his story. He talks to young people. He tells them, he warns them of the dangers of these recruiters, and he's really trying to prevent young people from turning to violence. And he also explained to us that he was a target because he had had an abusive childhood. He had grown up in a very, very complicated household. He was 18 when he was behind bars, and he was searching for something. He had a lot of anger, he had a lot of violence in him, and he was searching for him. And this sort of self-proclaimed imam came up to him, and he realized that he was fragile.
So 10 years on, Claire, what's the threat like today?
So we were given rare access. And if you watch the France in Focus show that I worked on with Joanna Cockrell, we were given rare access. You can see our images inside a telephone hotline, which is run by the French police. And anyone who fears that someone they know, a family member, a friend, someone they work with, could become a security risk can call that hotline anonymously and speak to a police officer. And they're also given counselling by a psychologist if they want it afterwards. Now, Karine Vialat, we can see there, she's in charge of the counterterrorism unit, which this hotline is part of. And she actually said to us that today they're having to handle multiple rapidly changing threats. And we can listen to her now. This is actually her first televised interview.
We're dealing less with the kind of individuals we call hardened, those who have been involved in radicalization for many years and who hold strong ideological convictions. Instead, we're faced with individuals who are sometimes unknown to intelligence services and who can become radicalized quite quickly, particularly through social media.
So what they've noticed is that more and more young people, we're talking teenagers, are being reported for having become radicalized, very often online, on social networks. And that's different from 10 years ago. So the profile seems to be getting younger. We're also told, though, that the intelligence services and the security services in France are also better now at finding and doing surveillance and finding people who are either at risk or have become radicalized. So there are more reports coming in, but that's partly because the police are getting better at the job. But the other thing is the profile is changing because now younger people are becoming radicalized faster, and often they're unknown. Sometimes they are unknown to the security services or the intelligence services. And we're not just seeing this has moved far beyond Islamist extremism. This is going towards the police are saying they're seeing far-right extremists, they're seeing far-left extremists too, and it's all becoming a complicated picture. So 10 years later, the police, the security services, the intelligence services have a better idea what they're doing, but the threat is changing. And we can listen again to Karine Vialat explaining that to us.
The proportion of minors monitored for terrorist-related radicalization tripled between 2020 and 2025. While it still represents a relatively small share of all individuals being monitored, fortunately, this illustrates the growing prevalence of the phenomenon.
So what we're seeing now is the social networks are turbocharging, basically, the recruitment process. So the police are on it, but the threat is changing rapidly. It's diversifying too. And it seems to be the profiles of those becoming radicalized seem to be getting younger than they were 10 years ago.
All right, Claire, thanks so much for your reporting along with Joanna Cockrell. And we can watch your France in Focus show called France's Fight Against Extremism on our website. Thanks so much for coming in.